The Galactic Empire believed there was nothing left in the universe that could surprise them. For centuries, they had conquered system after system, bringing countless species under their rule. Their admirals carried themselves with a certainty that only came from generations of victories. In their archives, there were records of battles won before they had even begun, rebellions crushed before the first sparks had spread, and civilizations erased from memory because they dared to resist. To them, combat was no longer a mystery. It was an equation, a calculation they believed they had solved long ago. When their scouts first mentioned a new species, humans, from a small blue planet called Earth, the reports were met with laughter in the war councils. The officers looked at one another, amused by the thought that such a distant and underdeveloped race could pose any challenge. According to their scans, Earth ships were small compared to Imperial cruisers, and their fleets were modest, hardly worth notice. Their weapons, though powerful by their own standards, looked primitive when compared to the advanced plasma cannons and shielded carriers of the Empire. On paper, the humans were no threat at all. The Empire decided not to negotiate, not to observe, and not to study. Instead, they chose to make an example. A decision was passed down to launch what they called a demonstration campaign. To the generals, this was not war. It was theater, a show of overwhelming power designed to scare the humans into submission before they even thought of resisting. In their arrogance, they announced their intentions openly. Imperial transmitters beamed a message into human space, translated into Earth's languages with deliberate coldness: submit or be crushed. The words were carried on channels across the planet, and many within the Empire expected fear, begging, or silence. But what came instead unsettled even the most confident commanders. The humans responded quickly, not with surrender, but with defiance. The people of Earth had heard of empires before. They had read about conquerors in their own history, empires that rose, claimed invincibility, and then fell. They knew what it meant to be underestimated, and they refused to kneel. On the surface of Earth, preparations began immediately. Factories lit up night and day. Engineers worked without rest, designing and modifying ships to close the gap between their technology and the Empire's. Soldiers drilled in every corner of the globe, uniting under one banner in a way that surprised even themselves. Earth had been divided many times in its past, but the threat from the stars erased borders and rivalries. For the first time, they fought as one species, not as separate nations. Still, the Empire was confident. Their fleet stretched across hundreds of star systems. Their warships were colossal, their armor nearly impenetrable, and their firepower capable of glassing planets. In the eyes of the Imperial High Command, humanity's preparations were the efforts of frightened children arming themselves with sticks. They believed victory would come so swiftly that future generations of humans would barely remember the conflict. When the first wave of Imperial ships crossed into human territory, their officers stood on their bridges with smug certainty. The fleet's flagship was a vessel the size of a small city, its hull gleaming with layers of armor. Thousands of weapons were mounted across its surface, each capable of destroying entire squadrons. Behind it stretched rows upon rows of warships, carriers, and destroyers, all moving in perfect formation. To the Empire, it was not just a fleet. It was the embodiment of their superiority. From their orbit above Earth, they broadcast their final warning. Their commanders expected fear in the human leaders' voices, perhaps last-minute pleas for mercy. But the humans answered differently. Calm, steady words were transmitted back. If you come to conquer us, you will not leave unchallenged. The Empire dismissed the statement as empty bravado, but in the back of some officers' minds there was a strange unease. Something in the human tone did not sound like desperation. It sounded like a promise. The humans knew they were facing an enemy larger and more advanced than any in their history. Yet they also knew something the Empire did not understand. Humans had lived with conflict for as long as they could remember. They had fought in deserts, jungles, mountains, and oceans. They had faced starvation, disease, and disasters. They had built their civilizations on worlds of fire, storms, and shifting earth. Survival was written into their very nature, and when threatened, they did not simply surrender. They adapted. As the first human fleets mobilized, the contrast between them and the Empire was striking. Human ships were smaller, their designs rougher, their hulls patched with hurried upgrades, yet there was a raw determination in the way they moved. Each crew carried not just orders but conviction. They were not fighting for conquest nor for expansion. They were fighting for home, for family, for the right to exist. The Empire could not see this. From their view, the humans were outmatched and outnumbered. In the halls of the High Command, they were already writing reports of a swift victory to be shared across the galaxy. They imagined the humans bending under Imperial authority, becoming just another subject species in their growing collection. But in quiet moments, far from their leaders, some Imperial officers began to whisper doubts. They had reviewed human history, and what they saw troubled them. Unlike many species the Empire had faced, humans did not shy away from conflict. Time and again they had risen from destruction, rebuilt after collapse, and turned defeats into lessons. There was a saying recorded in one of their texts: "Fall 7 times, rise 8. The Empire did not understand it, but they felt an unfamiliar unease. As the fleets drew closer, Earth's defenders watched from their stations, their hands steady on their controls. Pilots checked their systems, engineers monitored reactors, and commanders reviewed every detail of their strategies. They were not blind to the size of the force approaching them. They knew the risks, the likelihood of loss, the reality of facing an enemy with centuries of experience. Yet none of it broke their resolve. For the Empire, this was routine. For the humans, this was survival. The night before the first clash, a silence fell across Earth. In cities and villages, people looked up at the stars, knowing that the future of their species would soon be decided. Some whispered prayers, some held on to loved ones, and some prepared themselves for sacrifice. But not one voice called for surrender. When the dawn broke over the planet, the Empire's fleet was already in position, ready to strike. And in that moment, as the first human ships rose from their home world to meet the invaders, something shifted in the galaxy. A confrontation was about to begin, not just between fleets, but between two very different understandings of war. The Empire believed they had mastered combat. The humans were about to show them that they had only scratched the surface. The Empire's fleet entered human space like a storm, confident and unshaken. Their ships moved in tight formations, massive war cruisers gliding beside carriers that looked like floating fortresses. Each one carried enough firepower to destroy entire cities in a single strike. From the bridges of those ships, Imperial commanders watched the empty blackness of space around them, waiting for the first glimpse of the human defenders. The expectation was simple. The humans would scatter, terrified at the sight of such overwhelming power. Perhaps a few ships would attempt to resist, but they would be swatted away quickly, their wreckage serving as a warning to the rest. The Empire had done this before countless times, and the outcome had never been in doubt. But this time, things did not unfold as expected. When the first human fleet came into view, the Empire's officers leaned forward in disbelief. The human ships were smaller, less polished, and seemed almost fragile compared to the armored hulls of the invaders. Yet they did not retreat. They moved in tight patterns, adjusting constantly, as though their crews were reading the battlefield in real time. Their ships darted between the larger vessels like wolves circling a herd, refusing to give the Empire the satisfaction of an easy kill. The order was given. The Empire fired first. Beams of brilliant light streaked across the void, tearing through the dark and slamming into the nearest human ship. Alarms rang inside as panels burst and sparks filled the air. But instead of falling apart, the humans held formation. They took the hit, steadied themselves, and responded with a counterattack that surprised their enemies. Human weapons were crude by comparison, yet they carried a brutal precision. Where the Empire fired in sweeping waves of destruction, the humans aimed carefully, striking at weak points in armor, communication nodes, and engines. One of the Imperial destroyers shuddered violently as human fire tore through its rear thrusters, leaving it drifting helplessly in the void. The Empire's commanders had not expected losses this early, certainly not against opponents they considered primitive. Inside human ships, the atmosphere was tense but steady. Pilots gripped their controls tightly, guiding their craft through storms of enemy fire. Engineers worked in frantic silence, rerouting power, sealing hull breaches, and repairing systems as quickly as they were damaged. Every crew member understood the stakes. This was not just a battle for territory, but for survival itself. If Earth fell, there would be nothing left to protect. And so the humans fought with a determination the Empire could not comprehend. Even when a ship was struck beyond repair, Its crew continued fighting until the very last moment, refusing to give their enemies the satisfaction of surrender. Escape pods launched only when absolutely necessary, and many stayed behind to ensure their comrades had enough time to flee. On the Imperial side, confusion spread. Their strategies were not working as they always had. The humans refused to break. Their formation shifted constantly, adapting to every move the Empire made. What was supposed to be a swift display of superiority was beginning to feel like a real war, and that realization unsettled the Empire more than they cared to admit. One of the admirals, watching the battle unfold on his massive display screens, frowned deeply. He had seen hundreds of battles, but something about the humans' response troubled him. Their ships did not have the same shielding or armor, yet they moved with a kind of unpredictability that made them difficult to corner. Each time the Empire tried to press forward, the humans countered with an unexpected maneuver, forcing the invaders to regroup. Worse still, the humans were not afraid of taking damage. Where most species panicked at the thought of being struck, the humans pushed forward even through fire. A ship missing half its hull still managed to ram into an Imperial cruiser, crippling it before finally going silent. The sacrifice shook the Imperial crews who had never seen such reckless, fearless combat before. For the humans, this was instinct. They had always lived with struggle. They had built civilizations while enduring natural disasters, fought wars that spanned continents, and faced enemies stronger than themselves throughout their history. Survival required not just courage, but the ability to endure, to take punishment and keep moving. It was not that humans enjoyed suffering, but that they had learned long ago that pain was not the end. It was simply part of the fight. As the clash dragged on, the Empire realized this was no minor skirmish. Hours passed, and still the humans refused to yield. Smoke filled their corridors, fires raged inside their ships, and alarms never seemed to stop ringing. Yet their crews carried on with the same determination as when the battle began. From the surface of Earth, millions watched the broadcasts. Families huddled together, eyes fixed on the skies above where their defenders fought against impossible odds. Every loss hurt, every explosion was felt. But each time a human ship struck back, hope flared brighter. They understood that they were not witnessing defeat. They were witnessing defiance. In the Empire's command halls, the mood shifted from arrogance to irritation, then to something bordering on fear. Losses were mounting, and the humans were not fighting like anyone they had ever faced before. They were not disciplined in the same way Imperial troops were. They were something different, chaotic, creative, and relentless. A commander, his voice heavy with frustration, remarked that humans were fighting as though they had nothing left to lose. But others quickly realized that was not true. Humans were not fighting out of despair. They were fighting because they had everything to protect. For the first time in centuries, the Empire found itself on uncertain ground. Their weapons were superior, their numbers overwhelming, yet the battle did not feel like a guaranteed victory anymore. The humans had shown them something alien, a refusal to bend, a refusal to accept what seemed inevitable. By the time the first clash ended, neither side could claim total victory. The Empire had destroyed many human ships, but they had paid a price they never expected. Several of their own war vessels floated in ruins, struck down by opponents they had dismissed as unworthy. The humans, bloodied and battered, had survived the storm. When the surviving human ships regrouped, battered but still functional, they sent a final transmission into the void. Their message was short and steady. "We are still here." Those words carried across the Empire's fleet like a shadow. They were not the desperate cry of a dying race. They were a warning, a promise that the fight had only begun. And for the first time in living memory, the Empire began to understand fear. When the first space battles ended without a clear Imperial victory, the Empire grew restless. They had expected the humans to fall quickly, to beg for peace or scatter into the shadows of their own world. Instead, the humans still stood, scarred but unbroken. That was something the Empire could not tolerate, so they changed their strategy. If humans would not surrender in space, then the Empire would crush them on the ground. Troop carriers, massive in size, descended through Earth's atmosphere. Their shadows stretched across fields, forests, and cities as they prepared to unleash armies bred for war. To the Empire, ground battles were routine. They had fought them on hundreds of planets before against dozens of species. Their soldiers were disciplined, armored, and armed with weapons designed to cut through any resistance. Victory, they believed, was only a matter of time. But what they found on Earth was nothing like they expected. The first landings began in open plains and abandoned industrial zones. Imperial forces marched in formation, their banners raised, their steps heavy against the soil of a world they intended to claim. They expected panic, but instead they found silence. The cities were not deserted, but the humans were waiting. They had dug trenches, built hidden bunkers, and fortified streets with whatever they could. From factories and farms, they had crafted weapons suited to the terrain. The first shots rang out not from starships above, but from human rifles below. Bullets cracked through the air, striking Imperial armor with a precision that shocked them. Explosions followed as hidden charges tore apart landing craft. The Empire, so confident in their superior training, suddenly found themselves under fire from every direction. Humans did not fight like other species. They did not stand in straight lines or wait for orders in silence. They used the terrain like it was part of their own bodies. In forests, they blended with trees, striking from shadows before vanishing again. In mountains, they used cliffs and caves to launch ambushes. In cities, they turned every street into a trap, every window into a sniper's nest. The Empire's soldiers were trained for control and order, but the humans thrived in chaos. A patrol of Imperial troops might march confidently through a ruined neighborhood, only to find the ground itself exploding beneath them as humans triggered hidden mines. Tanks that rolled through open squares were met with fire from rooftops and underground tunnels. Every step forward cost the Empire dearly, but it was not only tactics that unsettled the invaders. It was the will of the humans themselves. The Empire had fought species that surrendered quickly when outnumbered, armies that broke apart when their leaders fell. But the humans did not break. When a unit was surrounded, they fought until the very last moment. When a commander fell, another soldier took charge without hesitation. Even civilians, farmers, workers, medics took up arms when the chance came. It seemed that on Earth everyone was a warrior when the time demanded it. Imperial commanders struggled to understand this. They asked themselves, why did these humans fight so hard? Why risk everything instead of bending to the inevitable? The answer was simple. Though the Empire could not see it, the humans were not fighting for orders. They were fighting for family, for children, for homes they had built with their own hands. They were not just soldiers, they were protectors. And a protector fights with a strength no invader can measure. Reports began flooding into the Empire's high command, each one darker than the last. Units were pinned down in forests, unable to move without being ambushed. Supply lines were cut by small groups of human fighters striking deep behind enemy lines. Even when the Empire captured territory, they could not hold it for long. Humans fought in waves, striking at night using weather, terrain, and even their own injuries to keep pushing forward. One Imperial officer noted in frustration, "They do not fear death the way others do." And he was right. To the humans, death was not the end of the fight. It was part of the price they were willing to pay to ensure survival for those who came after. The turning point on the ground came during a battle near a great river valley. The Empire had landed thousands of troops bringing tanks and air support, determined to secure the region. On paper, the numbers were overwhelming. Yet the humans knew the land better than anyone. They flooded fields, collapsed bridges, and forced the enemy into narrow choke points. Imperial tanks became trapped in mud, their heavy machines sinking while human fighters swarmed around them with improvised explosives. It was here that the Empire saw something that shook them deeply. A small band of human soldiers, outnumbered and surrounded, refused to retreat. They fought in the rain, in the mud, against machines 3 times their size. Even when ammunition ran low, they did not stop. They scavenged from fallen enemies, turned wreckage into weapons, and fought with everything they had. When the smoke cleared, the Empire had claimed the field, but at a cost so high it no longer felt like victory. Whispers spread among the Imperial ranks. Soldiers who had once marched with pride now muttered about the humans' ferocity. "They are not soldiers," one said quietly. "They are something else, something harder." Fear began to creep into voices that had never known it before. For the humans, every day of resistance was proof that they could endure. They buried their fallen with heavy hearts, but each loss only fueled their determination. In homes and shelters, children listened to the stories of battles fought nearby. Far from weakening their spirits, it made them stronger. The message was clear. Humanity would not surrender no matter how great the odds. The Empire's ground campaign meant to crush resistance in days dragged on week after week. Their resources drained, their morale weakened, and their commanders grew desperate. They had underestimated not just human technology, but the human spirit. As the smoke of battle rose into the skies, the galaxy watched closely. Other species, long oppressed under Imperial rule, began to whisper of hope. If humans could resist, perhaps others could too. The idea of Imperial invincibility, once unshakable, was now cracked. And in the quiet moments after each clash, as human fighters rested their weary bodies, they knew one thing with certainty. This war was not just about survival anymore. It was about proving to the galaxy that Earth was not a world to be conquered. The Empire had come to teach the humans submission. Instead, they were learning a lesson they would never forget, that on Earth even the ground itself fought against invaders. And the warriors of this planet, fragile in appearance but unbreakable in will, were unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced. The war was no longer a secret confined to the edges of the galaxy. Word had spread far beyond Earth and the Empire. Traders whispered it in spaceports. Resistance groups repeated it in hushed meetings, and oppressed species across dozens of worlds listened with wide eyes. The story was simple but powerful. Humans were standing against the Empire, and they were not falling. For the first time in centuries, the idea of Imperial invincibility was being questioned. Until then, no one had dared believe such a thing was possible. The Empire had crushed every rebellion, silenced every uprising, and reduced whole civilizations to ash. But humans were different. They refused to kneel, and their defiance was beginning to change more than just their own fate. It was starting to shift the balance of the galaxy. The Empire, however, could not accept this. Their pride was wounded, and their commanders grew desperate. They doubled their efforts, sending larger fleets, more troops, and more resources into the human warfront. They believed that by sheer weight of numbers, they would drown Earth's defenders. But the harder they pushed, the harder the humans fought back. In orbit, human fleets began to do something no one had expected. They adapted faster than the Empire could counter. At first, their ships had been crewed and patched together. Now, with each battle, they learned. Damaged vessels returned to shipyards and came back stronger. Tactics changed overnight. What worked for the Empire yesterday was useless today. Human commanders refused to follow rigid patterns. They treated every fight like a puzzle, improvising solutions in the middle of chaos. Instead of attacking directly, they lured Imperial fleets into asteroid fields, forcing massive warships to maneuver clumsily, while smaller human craft darted through the rocks like predators. In one battle, a single human destroyer managed to cripple a much larger carrier by baiting it into firing its cannons at the wrong moment, causing the blast to ricochet off a moon's surface and back into its own fleet. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. Other species fought predictably, their strategies written in manuals that rarely changed. But humans, they treated war like a living thing, constantly evolving. On the ground, the story was much the same. The Empire poured soldiers and machines into Earth's soil, but they were never able to fully control it. Humans struck from forests, deserts, mountains, and ruined cities. Entire divisions would vanish into the landscape, only to reappear days later behind Imperial lines, cutting supply routes and dismantling outposts. It was a nightmare for the invaders, who had never fought an enemy so unwilling to give up. What frightened the Empire most was not just the ferocity of the humans, but the unity that had emerged among them. In the past, Earth had been divided by nations and politics, but faced with extinction, those divisions crumbled. Farmers fought beside soldiers, scientists worked alongside mechanics, and people who had once been rivals now stood shoulder to shoulder. It was not simply an army. It was a species fighting as one. And slowly, the war began to turn. The Empire's casualties rose higher than they had in centuries. Their treasury bled resources. Their soldiers whispered in fear, refusing to underestimate the humans anymore. For every city block they captured, they paid with rivers of their own blood. For every fleet they destroyed, 2 more human squadrons rose from the planet below. Then came the moment that changed everything. The battle above the frozen moon. The Empire had gathered a massive fleet, determined to cut off Earth from its allies and crush its defenders once and for all. Their warships, larger than anything humans had ever faced, filled the dark sky. Their commanders declared it would be the end of human resistance, but the humans had a different plan. They knew they could not win by brute force. So instead they used cunning. They baited the Empire into spreading its fleet too thin, lured by what seemed like a retreat. Then, hidden among the ice fields, human ships emerged in coordinated strikes. Explosions ripped through the Imperial formation as mines, disguised as chunks of frozen rock, detonated at close range. The battle raged for hours, and at its peak, something unimaginable happened. A small human strike team boarded the Empire's flagship itself. Against impossible odds, they sabotaged its core systems, forcing the largest ship in the fleet to break apart from within. The sight of the flagship exploding sent shockwaves through the Empire's forces. For the first time, the humans had not only survived, they had forced the Empire into retreat. Across the galaxy, the news spread like fire. People whispered the impossible truth. The humans had defeated an Imperial fleet. Oppressed species long bowed under the Empire's rule felt hope stir in their hearts. If humans could resist, then maybe freedom was not just a dream. The Empire tried to downplay the loss, calling it an accident or a minor setback, but no one believed them. The cracks in their reputation were too visible now. The invincible conquerors had been beaten by a world they had once mocked as primitive. Among the humans, spirits soared. They buried their dead with heavy hearts, but their determination burned brighter than ever. They had proven to themselves and to the galaxy that they were more than survivors. They were fighters, warriors, and they were capable of standing toe-to-toe with the most powerful force the galaxy had ever known. Imperial leaders behind closed doors argued bitterly. Some demanded a total annihilation of Earth, no matter the cost. Others warned that the humans were not like any enemy they had ever faced, that continuing the war would only bleed the Empire dry. The arrogance that had once filled their voices was gone, replaced by frustration, fear, and doubt. But for humanity, the path was clear. They knew the war was far from over. More battles would come. More sacrifices would be demanded. Yet something had shifted forever. They were no longer fighting to merely survive. They were fighting to prove a point to the entire galaxy, that humanity was here to stay and no empire would erase them. The Empire had come believing the war would end in days. Now months had passed and the humans stood stronger than ever. The galaxy watched in awe as Earth, a single blue world, held its ground against a power that had ruled for centuries. The turning point had come, and it carried a message that echoed across the stars. Humans were not just survivors. They were warriors, and the galaxy would never see them the same way again. The Empire had never known humiliation like this. For centuries, their fleets had swept across the stars like an unstoppable tide, crushing every world that dared to resist. But Earth was different. What was meant to be a quick campaign had stretched into months of bitter fighting. Their ships lay in ruins, their armies were bleeding, and their pride, the thing they cherished most, was shattered. Across the galaxy, whispers grew louder. In marketplaces, in mining stations, and in the dark corners of occupied worlds, people repeated the same words: "The humans are winning." At first, it sounded like madness. How could a single planet, with far less technology, hold back the greatest empire in known space? But the reports were undeniable. The humans had not only survived, they had forced the Empire into retreat. For Earth, the war was far from over. Cities were scarred, fields burned, and families mourned, loved ones lost in the fighting. Yet in every home, in every shelter, the spirit of defiance burned stronger than before. The people of Earth understood something vital. They had changed the galaxy. No longer were they seen as a small, forgotten species from the edge of space. Now they were known as warriors. When the Empire returned with yet another offensive, the humans were ready. This time they did not wait for the invaders to land. Instead, they carried the fight outward into the cold dark of space. Fleets launched from Earth and its colonies, smaller in number but sharper in skill. They struck at supply convoys, raided isolated outposts, and forced the Empire to fight battles on dozens of fronts. Each engagement was costly, but every time, the humans learned and adapted. The Empire, used to enemies folding under pressure, struggled to keep pace. Their commanders clung to old strategies, unable to comprehend how their foes could shift tactics so quickly. The more the humans fought, the more unpredictable they became. A maneuver that failed in one battle would appear again in another. Modified, refined, turned into something new. The galaxy watched in awe as human ingenuity clashed with imperial tradition. One by one, the myths of imperial invincibility crumbled, and with each crack, hope grew among those who had long been silent. But for the humans, the war was not only about tactics or victories. It was about meaning. They fought for the people waiting back home, for the children who asked if the stars would still belong to them tomorrow. They fought because surrender was not in their nature, and this spirit, this relentless will, was something the Empire could not measure or predict. One of the fiercest battles came near a system of twin suns, where the Empire assembled a massive armada to crush human resistance once and for all. The fleet was so large it blocked out the stars, a wall of steel and fire meant to finally erase the defiant species from history. But the humans did not flinch. Their ships were outnumbered, their weapons weaker, yet their resolve did not waver. As the battle began, they used every trick they had learned, maneuvering through radiation fields, using solar flares as cover, and striking at weak points with brutal precision. The fighting stretched for hours, both sides throwing everything they had into the void. When the dust settled, the humans still stood. Battered and broken, yes, but unbroken in spirit. The Empire, despite its overwhelming force, had once again failed to destroy them. It was at this point that even the Empire's own officers began to admit the truth, though only in whispers. They said quietly among themselves, "We thought we understood combat. We were wrong. The humans fight with something we do not have. That something was not technology or numbers. It was will. It was the refusal to be conquered. It was the simple, unshakable truth that humans would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The lesson spread beyond the battlefield. Other species, once silent, began to stir. They had long accepted imperial rule as inevitable, but the humans had shown them another way. If Earth could resist, then maybe freedom was possible for all. Small uprisings began to flare across the galaxy, inspired by the courage of a world the Empire had once dismissed as primitive. For humanity, victory was not about claiming territory or building an empire of their own. It was about survival, about showing the universe that they belonged among the stars. They did not fight for conquest. They fought for the right to exist, for the families waiting back home, and for the promise of a future where no one could dictate their destiny. As the final battles slowed, the Empire withdrew, humiliated but unwilling to admit defeat openly. They called it a strategic realignment, a hollow phrase to cover their failure. But no one in the galaxy was fooled. The truth was clear. Humanity had faced the greatest military power in existence and had not been broken. On Earth, there was no celebration of conquest, only quiet relief. Families reunited, communities rebuilt, and people mourned their dead. The cost had been high, but the outcome carried a weight far greater than victory. The humans had taught the galaxy a lesson that could never be forgotten. They showed that combat was not about the size of fleets or the strength of weapons. It was about resilience, creativity, and spirit. It was about the determination to stand when everyone else expected you to fall. The Empire would recover as empires always tried to. But from that day onward, they would never underestimate Earth again. Every time their leaders spoke of war, they remembered the stubborn warriors from the small blue planet who had defied them. And the galaxy, watching from the shadows, now saw humanity in a new light. They were no longer unknown. They were no longer underestimated. They were known as the warriors of the stars, unpredictable, relentless, and impossible to break. On Earth, as dawn rose over battered cities and scarred fields, people looked to the sky with pride. They had not just defended their home. They had written their place into history. The Empire had come to teach humans submission. But in the end, it was the Empire that walked away with a lesson etched into every soldier, every commander, and every world that had once believed them unbeatable. Humans had proved something simple yet unshakable. You could break their ships, you could burn their cities, you could wound their bodies, but you could never break their will. And from that day forward, no one in the galaxy ever forgot it.